Okay, this is the video about text and books, digital text, digital documents, anything with words and letters that we read or can say out loud using our mouth. Um, there are going to be a lot of different technologies that we're going to learn about and hopefully get to use, and some different concepts and key terms that are really quite a bit different from what we did with images and with our unit on audio and video. There is some overlap though. Some examples of text or documents: we could think of books, letters, logbooks, databases. Databases being a born digital document or text. Website, again, born digital. Maps, computer code. Anything what we think of as spoken language that is written down, that's what we tend to think of text. We've got a few different definitions used here. If some of you are literature majors, the idea of what a document is almost a whole discussion unto itself, and it can get kind of philosophical and pretty far out there. But basically what we, in terms for digital libraries, we have a very practical meaning when we talk about document or textual digital objects. So we have the idea of documents or records. What are they? Well, they could be a lot of different things. Again, when you get philosophical about it, a movie could be a document, a painting could be a document or a record. But when we talk about it for the purposes of this course, we're mainly concerned with information written or typed in a spoken language using words with some pictures. Librarians and archivists, we tend to focus on format, though scholars, again, thinking like a literature department, might think more about function. If you all, I can't remember if IST 602 is still required or if it's an elective now, but that's a class where you really dig into like what's a document and how they're formed, and really get into sort of the philosophical aspects of that. But we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to keep it pretty straightforward when we talk about text and documents. So once again, the why of digital libraries, like, why do we need digital libraries? Well, once again, here's another format that when we're trying to lower the barriers to access of human knowledge, and you think about what those barriers are, again, with images, audio, video, and text. In order to get documents and text into a digital library, what processes need to take place? And what are the costs, the equipment, skills, and staffing? And we're going to talk about that in this presentation. So putting text into your digital library, a scanned page or text is just a picture. It's not searchable. So if I were to scan a book chapter, the scanning we've talked about so far, it's really just an image. Even though there's text that you're reading, the computer does not see text. It's only seeing really an image that just happens to have text on there. It doesn't really care. Methods for converting that text into something that is searchable we call optical character recognition. There's also something you can also hand key it in as well, where you are essentially letting the computer take a picture of the scanning or imaging of that document, and then you would have a human actually with a keyboard, double key that in. But in general, that's not done too much anymore. In the days when OCR was still kind of burgeoning, you would see a lot of hand entering, but now it's typically OCR is used. And then there's also text encoding. This is kind of related to what I just talked about, but this would be where you're using something like the text encoding initiative. I'll talk a little bit more about it later in the presentation, but that's where you're using XML technology, where you're using angled brackets and sort of HTML-like programming, I guess you would call it, to encode your text and put it into a digital library. And that's done for different reasons, which we'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation. So if you're digitizing, okay, we're not talking about born digital, we're talking about digitizing. You're often dealing with Fragile or difficult to scan objects, so a book, right away you're presented with a few issues there. How do you get it flat down onto the scanner to scan it? Sometimes in that case you would disbind, or take the binding off of a book, for example. Other things they do is actually called guillotining, putting it under a guillotine. It sounds kind of macabre, but they actually put the book and there's a big steel blade that comes down and cuts it, and what that does is, which is also called disbinding, but makes the cut really clean. So essentially what you're left with is a very uniform and very clean cut stack of pages, essentially, that then you can scan much more quickly, and more importantly be able to get into the gutter of the book that you're scanning. I should have put a photo up here on PowerPoint, but basically you're trying to get into the gutter, or the where the binding is, to get all those words and get them as scanned as nicely as possible, as cleanly as possible. There are other ways that you can correct for that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Loose pages or manuscripts, or sort of typewritten manuscripts, so these would be something that was done up in a typewriter and thrown in a folder, and you have perhaps the records of this, say, author. You might need to do special handling because it could be on onion skin, or it could be paper that is deteriorating. Those are all things you just need to consider when you're scanning. Optical character recognition, or OCR, we just typically call it OCR in the profession. When you have a document containing character images, they can be put through a scanner, and then the software, usually it's on the computer, it's not in the scanner itself, it's in the computer, takes that image. Again, you're not talking about letters yet, really the only thing the computer is seeing as an image, and runs software over it, and is able to turn those images into printed characters, into basically ASCII data, into machine readable characters. Indexing OCR text allows for keyword or full text searching. So if you want to index a collection of documents in your digital library, you need a way to index them. They can't, an indexing software cannot index images. It needs some kind of keywords, or in this case text that's been OCR'd, and it can do that even if it's not 100% accurate. Even if you get 80%, 90%, anything really, the indexing software will run with that and create an index from it, and that's what allows for keyword searching. And typically I'm sure seen this if you've done a Google search or a search in perhaps some kind of library catalog EBSCO. If you do a full text search, the retrieval that's brought back in those search results, typically those words you use, like World War II or Love Canal, or whatever the football and injuries, whatever the keywords you're using, when those results come back, typically those keywords are highlighted in the results, and so that's all part of the indexing process. But also what we're talking about now is that OCR was applied to those images. Now if they were porn digital, that's a whole other thing, because if you had a Word document that's already been text encoded, and they're text, they're not image documents, they truly are text documents, like Microsoft Word and so on and so forth. So that doesn't count for those. We're talking about more for things that have been scanned. So typically there needs to be some kind of hands-on process when you're OCRing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the OCR is not perfect, so you need to go in and correct it. If it's misspelled things, or if it's completely garbage, then you have to almost redo it by hand. OCR software has been around for a long time. It's really a miraculous invention, and the person who did it is kind of miraculous. He's a very smart man. This is Ray Kurzweil. We talked about him right at the beginning of the course. I would say he refined, if not invented, speech-to-text technology. So what spurred on OCR, which it's kind of interesting, is that really it was to support the blind and visually impaired communities. If you couldn't see what the text on a page, you basically ran it through this machine that Ray created that would take the text on a page and turn it into a spoken sound. OCR, because of that technology, needed both scanning but also this OCR technology. They kind of went hand in hand, and I'm not going to show it now, but here's a YouTube clip if you want to look at that. It talks about the development of that. But as I mentioned earlier in the class, Ray Kurzweil has been involved in many different things, and he's really now at the cutting edge of some of this really far out stuff. You can read about him on the web, but this notion of the singularity and so forth. But again, invented synthesizers, OCR and scanning, and he's done a lot of other things. He's probably got dozens of patents. Very amazing person. Okay, so OCR software. I don't actually know the one that Ray Kurzweil used, but I'm assuming that some of the software that was used to create that ended up in one of these ones we have listed here. So Tesseract is the one I hope to have you all do an exercise in. I haven't created the exercise yet, but I'm hoping to have it out soon. But basically, Tesseract is relatively new. It was developed by Google when they were doing the Google Books project, which, from what I understand, they've more or less abandoned that project. They did scan a lot, millions of books, and if you do a search on Google Books, you will find a lot of the books they digitized and OCR'd, and they used that, the OCR software they used was Tesseract. Sometimes it's called OCR hyphen Tesseract. So it's free, open source. We can download it, do whatever we want with it. Abby Fine Reader, that's probably one of the older commercial ones, if not the oldest, barring what Ray Kurzweil used. And probably what he used was something that it was an in-house piece of software that he only used for his project. I don't know if he ever commercially released the software, but Abby Fine Reader, it's a Russian company. It's been around since the 80s. I remember hearing about it when I was using computers as a kid. Adobe Acrobat, that was created in the 90s, and that's kind of the de facto software because it's just so the Adobe Acrobat, sort of like Microsoft Word. It's just any office situation. You're going to have people creating PDFs. You need Acrobat to create PDFs.